Chapter 201, Inside the Supermarket, Part 1. The performance continued for another quarter of an hour, without losing energy at all. May it be the performers or the audience, no one felt tired despite sweating from all the dancing under the heat from the mid-morning sun. The performance finally ended with a classic fable triple flip, and the audience applauded wildly, forming a little treble on the ground, almost like a small monster mob came. Everyone was at a high. They never thought they'd be able to feel this again. And Fable, breathless but bright, felt happy from the bottom of his heart. It was like he was brought back to when he was just starting in the industry, when the joy of performing in front of an audience was at its purest. At the time, even if it was just one audience, if he improved that person's day with his art, then it'd have made his week. He was happier today than he had been in the entire previous year, when he was at the height of fame. Anyway, Fable closed his eyes as he surrounded himself with the sound of applause and hoots, as if it could recover his spirit somehow. Nearby, the aborigines also followed the show of appreciation of the crowd and clapped their hands, also screaming. It was a novel experience, and they felt they'd remember it for a long time to come. The excited chatters and cheers continued until the large doors of the supermarket opened and began to let people pour in. Guards stood in front of the door and asked the people to line up, and they did so without any grumbling. Anyway, the show provided them with a lot of topics to chat about while they waited. That was so much fun. Kaya, Fable is so handsome. I know, I wonder since when did he get here? A gasp, I think I saw him. He was unsightly but he looked familiar at the time. I just thought I was hallucinating. Oh my, such a pity. Such a pity. Inside the building, the chatters were no less than those outside, but they were still organized despite the excitement, especially thanks to the private guards hired for this event. They would also be in charge of the security within the premises. Of course, this wasn't entirely needed because of the rule she set. Theft was prohibited. However, Althea felt a few guards were still needed to maintain order. She even added more sales clerks to guide the customers. With similar thoughts as to why she was maintaining the service and hospitality industries, she just thought adding human touch added meaning to mundane things. She hired one clerk per section, with a section having 3 working in shifts. This was just right considering the number of people allowed to enter at one time. Like the grocery store, the maximum number of people that could simultaneously enter the edifice was limited. This time, the limit was increased to 200 people at a time, so the people outside wouldn't need to wait too long. With their current population anyway. As for what could happen when the number of people spiked, she'd deal with that later. Back to the exterior of the structure, the line moved very slowly, with the slots for 200 people decreasing at a fast rate. Soon the person was blocked and while sad, he just chatted with the person next in line and patiently waited for his turn. The stall owners also mobilized and were wearing those small wooden platforms that were supported by their necks. On the platform were their respective products. It could be fruits, it could be processed meat, or it could be juice. This way, the people could also chew a few things to pass the time. There were even young kids offering massages, performances, and the like. A little boy even tried mimicking Fable's dances, though he failed miserably at cartwheel, and it made people laugh and gave him a few tips, though not without warning from older people to be careful with his neck, of course. Anyway, even waiting in line is so much fun now. The Aborigines were very enlightened. Soon, more and more people entered the interior of the supermarket, and this batch included the aborigines. The arrangement of the supermarket was very similar to the Terran versions. It had a large span and high ceilings, with an open plan filled with rows and rows of shelves, the height of a person. Between these shelves were wide walkways that could easily fit 3 people walking side by side, very airy and comfortable. Clutch and the other NPCs looked at the novel arrangement in interest, their peripheral view ending at the large weaved baskets by the entrance. They didn't know what it was for, but they saw that it was something the people in front of them were taking before moving forward. It was a basket made of treated wood, the size that could fit a small child. It also had wooden push handles extending upwards by about a foot, and with small wooden wheels below. Pushcart, another person said, and took a piece to enter the supermarket. Very naturally, a couple other people took their so-called pushcarts and entered the store. The NPCs looked at each other and followed what the Terrans were doing. You push it like this, Clutch asked, doing the motion. Brenda looked at the other people in front of them. You put things there, it seems. Troy smiled, thinking Brenda was cute. Yes, you place things you want to buy and pay for them in the exit. Oh, the NPCs said simultaneously, amusing those around them. Anyway, they entered and began their first supermarket shopping experience. The first floor was basically a larger version of the previous grocery store. Right in front of the counter were various earthenware like pots, pans, plates, bottles, and bowls. When earthenware was paid for, a special paint will be added to signify its own status. After all, some people would use these to contain the foodstuff they would buy later on. This was another difference with Terran grocery stores. The packaging either had to be bought inside or one had to bring their own. It was convenient, and just right considering there was an omnipotent system watching theft that could happen. Well, at least outside territory wars, in which all regulations would be halted, but that was an issue for later. There were more varieties and sizes now, and there were special versions of more intricate designs. Beyond the earthenware stores were the rice and wheat area. They were bought in kilograms. Next to it was processed food like pickled vegetables and jerkies. The variety of flavors had increased significantly. After all, a lot of seasonings had been formulated in the past week or so. There were also new additions that made the Terran's eyes brighten like the sun. Instant noodles and biscuits. Whoa! It's here, a gasp. I can't believe they already made this. This team is amazing. I'll take spicy flavor. Wow, what is this? Gooey berry flavor, that's new. There is also gougey fruit flavor. We have to adapt to local materials. Anyway, I believe in the products of this team. Yes, yes, another smiled, looking at the biscuits, promptly taking several bolts. He would buy several jams, and his breakfast would be fast and heavenly. People bought everything they could, maximizing their purchase limits, even if it meant siphoning their savings. Anyway, they knew the territory was stable, and they could comfortably earn it back. They were more scared the stocks would disappear when they needed them. The people had gotten to the point that they were more terrified of losing the opportunity to obtain these things than losing their savings. This was especially true for the store owners who had signed deals with the grocery store, so they luckily had much higher purchase limits. Seeing the Terrans so excited about the new additions, the leisurely NPCs couldn't help but ask. Gru, who was next to them, patted their shoulders. This is a special dish from our home. He said, they're not only delicious, easy to prepare, and easier to carry, they also have a very long shelf life. Everyone knew the system space didn't have a fresh-keeping function. As such, these food could really save lives during travels. They would be great for people on the go. You can eat delicious food even in the wild. Troy made a thumbs up. You NPCs will love it. Although Brenda and the others didn't know why they were called NPCs, they had long gotten used to the title. So they nodded and followed the experts in their shopping, observing the various flavors available for purchase. Like them, the Aborigines also placed several instant noodles inside. Anyway, they wouldn't go to waste. Even if they didn't like a particular flavor, someone else was bound to love it. Sadly, like before, their purchase limits were like everyone else's, so they couldn't take too much. The group continued on to other products, adding more and more to their carts that were already filled. Troy took 2 more, for him and Brenda. As they shopped, the Aborigines watched the people around gush about the products and couldn't help but feel amused and curious. As they did so, none of them lost in buying a bit of everything. And oddly enough, they also felt pride. These were all made by their lord. All these things were only available in their territory. How interesting. I'm really looking forward to what appears after this, Brenda mumbled, as she looked around the avid shoppers with a smile. Troy, who had been watching her reactions, grinned in turn. He happened to have a teammate who worked in the factory. He signed an NDA, but he could still guess quite a few things. If you think the food we made so far is delicious, then I can tell you haven't seen anything yet. Sure enough, they soon headed to the seasoning section. Here, there were new selections that made people cheer. Not only were there the previous varieties of sauces and spices, but there were also familiar ones from back home. Soy sauce, vinegar, chili, ready mixes. This was mostly the credit of the factory people and Althea's handy tablet. This also made the restaurant and food stall owners looked like they were having orgasm. As for the salt, she just discovered it and was ongoing processing. She planned to release it after a few days. It would be great if there was sugar too, but for now they could only settle with glucose from fruits. She watched the people excitedly buy as much as allowable, especially those shop and stall owners. There were also other cooking essentials like vegetable oils, so now they no longer had to settle with the subpar oil from monster meats. Speaking of meats, raw meat in the supermarket was unavailable until refrigeration could be done. Anyway, there was no shortage of monsters outside. This would also be another avenue for the residents to earn money. In another section of the supermarket, people were also cheering at the sight of familiar Terran fruits and vegetables. Tomatoes, peanuts, strawberries. How? It's amazing. To think they'd find Terran produce, it was like they never left. Everyone had excited smiles on their faces as they shopped galore, filling their cart up with what they could. Meanwhile, on the second floor, there were only 2 offerings at this time, as the others were still under development. However, they were no less loved than the products below. One half offered the various products by Baron's team like wood products, leather products, and others. Of course, they were sold at slightly higher prices than their own store, but people still bought it. After all, who would want to walk a kilometer when you have everything else here? And the other one made some mothers cry. It's fabric. Hemp and cotton cloth, though mostly hemp, with cotton costing 10 times due to its current lack of raw materials. There were a number of colors to choose from. First, the natural colors of dirty white for cotton and peach for hemps. Then there was the ochre color, which varied with the shade of yellow and red, depending on the iron content of the material. Finally, there was carbon black, traditionally produced by burning organic material, but the team was looking for alternatives. As for the other colors, aside from assigning a team dedicated to it, Althea was also planning on creating exploration teams needed to find mineral deposits and the like. But for now, these were more than enough, and this was evident at the tearing eyes of many citizens. It had been over almost 20 days since the migration. Their clothing had long been damaged by attacks and the environment. It got to the point that having a few holes in their clothing was fashionable. Now that they could finally get a few new ones, how could they not feel a bit teary? Although they don't really know how to make clothes. But they believed in other people's skills. However, someone still voiced this concern after a while. Are there no ready-made clothes? At this, the assigned clerk smiled and explained. Our company had already partnered with a number of cloth makers who would be producing the end product for the territory. There will be a clothing stores along the main avenue. They will open once the production of fabric stabilizes. Everyone's hearts lifted. They didn't know how it was in other territories, but they knew for sure they're living the good life now. Not only could they eat well, they could also sleep well. They could do what they wanted without fearing for their lives every day. They could willingly go outside to get stronger, and yet without fearing death every time they step out the gates. And now they could also dress well. Their spirits couldn't help but get lifted even more at an exciting thought. Who knew what things would be available next? The sense of dread towards the unknown slowly ebbed down, even for those who had just arrived. They couldn't help but look forward for the next day. That night, Althea called the NPCs and her inner circle to the second floor for a little behind-the-scenes celebration. She knew how hard these people worked to get the supermarket going within a few days. After all, every single one of the products was produced from its raw materials. Just the processing itself was no simple task. This was all done with limited technology and in such a short period of time. Even in Terran, this could be said to be a miraculous feat. She wanted her people to know that she appreciated their hard work and celebrate the end product with them. Of course, this dinner was not just to celebrate the opening of the supermarket. It was the fact that the completion of the supermarket in and of itself was a sign of the development of the entire territory. How many industries, how many more shops, how many jobs would be generated after this? How much wider would the product selections be? How many more food types would people be able to choose from? How nice would it be for the people hunting outside and the people guarding the territory to go back home and eat their hearts out? Wouldn't they work even harder, more passionate about protecting their good lifestyles? The building of the supermarket could be said to be the cementation of a promising future. This ought to be celebrated, no? Hence, later after the sunset, Althea smuggled Ansel and the others to the second floor through the warehouse door. "Wow, you do this every time you summon an NPC?" Sheila couldn't help but ask. She also asked this in a whispery voice by instinct, looking very shifty, as if people could still find them so near the warehouse. Except for Ansel, it was everyone's first time sneaking around like this, so they were naturally not very cool. Anyway, it was quite a fun experience. The children were even giggling and poking at each other. It was as if they were playing hide-and-seek with the entire territory. "Well, I can teleport directly to the warehouse, so it's not as troublesome." "Oh right," Sheila nodded, relieved. She then turned to the children, happily covering their mouths as if no one would hear their bubbly giggles. She shook her head with a smile on her own face. In contrast with their sneaking around, the NPCs went directly via the village center. Many people were curious but shrugged in the end. They heard the NPCs had an exclusive hangout there. They were quite curious, but it had nothing to do with them. As for the Aborigines climbing up the steps, they really didn't know what to expect. It was just that they found themselves a bit excited nevertheless. Soon the Aborigines and the gang entered the second floor, and they were surprised by the changes. Althea had commissioned Bianca and a few interior designers, temporarily allowed access and hired by the territory, with accompanying signed NDAs, to improve the furnishing of the second floor from sleek to gorgeous, and much more complete. There were now a few more couches, very plush and comfortable to look at, and a matching coffee table in front of it. There were also meeting and dining tables, drawers and bookshelves, though empty, for now, located in strategic places. The walls were adorned with a tasteful combination of vintage artwork, done by an artist via charcoal medium, the literal kind, and figurines, sculpted by Bianca and her team of artisans, creating a sense of nostalgia and curiosity. The partitions, made of a combination of wood and painted hemp fabric, delineated each area without enclosing them completely. The furniture themselves were intricately carved and very anthropomorphic, and the fabrics of the furniture and the carpets were made of soft monster fur. Someone went over to touch it. It was extremely comfortable. And the furniture, they weren't sure if it was just their imagination, but just looking at them relaxed them. In fact, they weren't wrong. There were actually two people who had awakened the life occupation of woodcarver during this time, both of whom were in Baron's team, and they did the special room justice. Not only were the products of these two gorgeous, but they also had the sublime effect of slowly increasing spirit the longer people stayed inside. There was also a set of plush armchairs and a side table next to the window, where the users could look down and see the bustle of the public square and parks below. The entire room was quaint, inviting, and warm. It offered a cozy and serene atmosphere that invited those who sought to relax and appreciate the surroundings. At the moment, though, the most distracting part of the room was the largest circular table filled with a wide array of food. Each and every one attacked all their senses, making them want to sit down. It was adorned with a feast of mouthwatering delights, and everyone's stomach bugs were successfully stimulated, especially Harold, who knew most about food, and he immediately made a commentary. A bruschetta for the appetizer. It uses Terran tomatoes, a local alternative for basil, and rich olive oil that had just been extracted. He then looked at the plate next to it. Then there are the cucumber and meat rolls, with sweet and sour sauce, assembled with elegance, offering a refreshing touch. Moving further along were varieties of salads and viands. Each bite looked very colorful and flavorful. Harold made sure to narrate in a very, very detailed manner, so it was like the food was asking them to sit down already and eat them up. They gulped. The main dishes were gugu birds with golden skin, succulent and gorgeous, as well as stormdua tenderloin, cooked to perfection and adorned with a savory crust of local herbs. They gulped again. Finally, there was the dessert dazzling with decadence. Because there was no sugar yet, and Terran fruits had yet to bloom, every dessert was made with local fruits. However, they were handled with such delicacy, one would think it was made of fruits from the gods. For example, the gougy fruit one could see everywhere was carved into interesting shapes like apples and an unfamiliar bird species, which Harold would call a swan later on. The fruits were arranged with different fruits, creating an interesting palette of colors and creating a work of art. The food was prepared by the private chef cook, with every food an absolute treat, and had an effect of increasing life and spirit. The Aborigines couldn't help but look at each other with complex emotions. Did the Lord prepare this for them? Whoa, Ansel commented, breaking the NPC's daze. This is pretty impressive. Althea watched everyone's reaction with a smile. Safe to say, they quite liked her surprise. Sit down, she told them, going to the table herself. On her signal, everyone quickly went to their seats, trying to stop themselves from drilling openly. Althea also took out the few jugs of wine from her space, placing them on the table. She uncorked it and let the aroma whiff out, making all adults drool. She had prepared these a few days back and buried them under the garden, as system fields also had the added effect of hastening fermentation. Now was the perfect time to finally taste it. Yes, I finally get to taste your wine again, Ansel said, rubbing his palms together and looking like a deprived alcoholic. He extended his claws to the jars, and it earned him a soft knuckle on the head instead. Ouch. Behave. Yes, sister. Everyone chuckled at the interaction, though their eyes quickly gravitated back to the sumptuous plates in front of them. The people tried to control their drooling, though to minimal effect, and for a moment Althea didn't want to make her speech. What if they didn't listen to her and stared at the food instead? In the end, with a bit of worry in her head, she still stood up on the small elevated platform at the corner of the room. Fortunately, they had the tact to focus their attention on her and not on the table. Heaving a deep breath, she began to speak. First of all, I would like to thank and congratulate everyone for a job well done. She smiled at them, very gently, to the point they blushed. Tonight we celebrate not only the successful opening of the supermarket, but also to celebrate what it represents, a better territory. This could not have been achieved, especially not so quickly, without you guys, so thank you. The small crowd shook their heads, feeling very shy. This was especially true for the Aborigines who were unused to getting compliments from nobles. The status of the Lord had always been so high, they were just doing their job. How dare they accept such deep compliments without tact? Today I'm awarding each of you with 5,000 contribution points. She said, it may not have much impact to you now, as you are either already residents or hired individuals, but eventually we will be opening shops specifically circulating only contribution points. Contribution points could also be used to purchase what money could, but with larger values. By that time, it would be helpful to you. There is no need to explain, my lord, we are already very honored, Lenny said, very embarrassed. She had only helped with the dyeing of the cloth, not nearly as important as the contribution of the others. Rowan and Betty also spoke out, they barely helped. We wouldn't have been able to develop our thoughts so carefree without the help of the guards and the clinic. How could people work on these luxuries if we still struggled with our safety and health? Don't underestimate your value. Credit must be given where it's due. She paused, eyes staying on certain people in particular. In line with this, I would like to call out Brenda, Eugene, and Oslo for their especially huge contribution to the many successes not only in the supermarket, but also in the territory. Speaking of, these three barely had any sleep the past week. Their eye bags were as large as their eyes themselves. It was Oslo who spoke this time. Your supplements were of much help, my lord, he said, and he wasn't even being a bootlicker. He was still amazed at the potions that came out of the Lord's hands. It was even more amazing than the mixtures he was used to. Coming from him, as someone who was born and raised in a city, this was a very big feat. No, your works have been indispensable to the current beauty of Altera, she said, looking at them with a large smile. Thank you. Rowan and the others felt a little teary, hearts filled with accomplishment and warmth. They had never been so acknowledged before. Most nobles they knew were extremely entitled. Everything that went well must have something to do with their existence. They would never take a second look at them, the mere servants. The three of you, Eugene, Oslo, and Brenda, have especially worked hard. I will give you another 2,000 contribution points and a bonus of 100 gold. She manifested the gold, placed in intricate boxes, and handed them to each of the three. Oslo actually grew up with a golden spoon, never lacking money, but these 100 gold felt extremely beautiful at the moment. You don't have to, my lord, Brenda spoke up. My professional level, which had been stagnant, moved, she said, feeling guilty for taking such an advantage. If anything, she should be paying the lord instead. It is the same with me, Clutch said, and the others nodded in agreement. It was really difficult to accept this with an open heart. They felt like they owed the lord way too much. Althea's eyebrows rose, interested in the so-called improvements. Instead of claiming credit, she thought of what else they could do for the territory and was looking forward to their surprises. Well then, I'm looking forward to what more you can offer, Althea. They stared at her for a while, absorbing, and when they understood what she meant, their hearts that had been filled up to the brim overflowed. Renewed strength and inspiration filled their hearts, and they stood up, bowing at an angle, showing the greatest respect. Yes, my lord. Such a kind lord, and her people, along with their novel ideas and beliefs, had unknowingly crept up their hearts and affected their very being. It had not even been a month, but truly, their previous lives felt like a lifetime away. Thinking about it now, they had no doubts. Accepting the job offer from this territory was the best decision they ever made. The celebratory dinner ended a bit over an hour later. Only Ansel and Althea remained on the floor, with Sheila and the others sneaking through the warehouse's back door. They still had plenty of things to discuss after all. Now alone in the beautifully designed lounge, the two siblings sat relaxedly by the coffee table. They were having tea to help them digest the marvelous meal they just had. Today they were ginger sagada tea, the local alternative to ginger mint tea, which was a soothing blend and was great to drink for a hungover. The tea was a steaming and fragrant infusion of the two plants and a few more flowers, and it permeated the room with pleasing warmth. Ah, this is the life, tilde, Ansel said, lounging about the large sofa in the room. He just had the most wonderful wine he had in a while, and now he was chilling with minty tea. There wasn't much actually, regrettably not enough to get him drunk, but he could take what he could get. Speaking of the drink, he couldn't help but recall the faces of the Aborigines when they took a sip of Althea's special wine. He could have sworn their souls left their bodies for a moment. The Aborigines are really quite interesting, he said, very amusing to watch, especially when they're exposed to our things in Terran. Well, they are indeed quite fun, she said, and surprisingly quite sincere. Ansel couldn't help but recall how they were during the party, and how they were near tears with so little, exacerbated by the wonderful alcohol they were having. They definitely fell in love with the territory, Althea. You're amazing, Ansel said, pausing, looking out the window, and staring at one of the strange moons of this world. I have a hunch they'd be of great help with our assimilation with the outside world. Althea nodded, agreeing. The outside world, from the Aborigines' words alone, was obviously a large and dangerous place, much more than what they had encountered so far. However, the unknown also presented a lot of opportunities, so Althea was bent on making her territory benefit from the opening or transition from the protective period, rather than fear its disappearance. One of the ways to do this with the least risk was to have good NPCs, especially with the system assurance that they could not do any harm to the territory, even if they wanted to, and even if they were no longer associated with it. I hope I get a good one today, she said with a hint of prayer. She would be taking Ansel to the NPC summoning today, hoping to get a decent hire. The past few days there had been regrettably no decent NPC options to choose from, and it was such a pity. Whichever one it was that she had hired, they were all so helpful. She had no doubt that the territory and its people wouldn't have grown to such a degree so quickly if they weren't there to guide them. With a bit of hope, Althea climbed to the summoning platform and paid the required silver for summoning. Unfortunately, her luck still wasn't very good. One was a book boy, though he looked like in his 30s. Should it be called a bookman instead? His job description was literally just to carry books and other basic personal assistant tasks like cleaning up after their master. His tagline was, I clean up all the messes of my boss, no matter how dirty. Another was yet another woman with a questionable job description. This one was still wearing revealing clothing, which was actually not that common even with women of the same job, and she could see over half the woman's breasts. She gave Ansel a furtive glance, curious about his reaction, and he was offended she was watching his reaction at all. I don't play with those things. Okay, sure. Hey. Althea shrugged and ignored him, activating her final slot for the day. It was a cleaner, specifically a feces cleaner, because most territories didn't really do hygiene facilities at all. Still none today, it seemed. She sighed with regret. Ansel, a born businessman, thought a bit differently. Well, it probably meant that most professionals don't choose to get hired this way, at least not to our small villages. Althea paused, then after thinking about it, she nodded. It made sense. The NPCs had told her professionals were rare, they were most likely in demand in territories much better than mere villages. Then, why would Oslo and the others choose to get hired in her little village? Althea couldn't help but think more of the NPCs that were in the territory. To accept getting hired in a village, and she was still a level 1 village at the time, there must have been other reasons for them to end up here, rather than them just looking for a job. As she mused the intricacies of it all, she couldn't help but overhear Ansel's mumbling. She ended up watching him enter soliloquy. Ansel at this time was walking around the summoning circle, fascinated, droning on about the magic and how cool it was. This is a real magical technology, summoning people from somewhere to here. He paused, seriously pondering, I wonder who's in charge of all this. This statement made Althea pause. A part of her probably thought subconsciously, due to the game elements, that this was a bit like a game. It was why most of them referred to the Aborigines as NPCs, subconsciously lightening up all these tragedies by likening them to games. She forgot that every function probably had a force behind it. These magical buildings and their functions, who developed them? Was there some organization that controlled them? Were all these, whether it was NPC hiring or the building of structures, being overseen and managed by a certain force, or maybe multiple? Perhaps they even had different departments. How interesting, she thought, but she did not dwell on it. She'd just ask Oslo in case he knew, and if he didn't, well, it didn't matter. She had too many things on her plate at the moment anyway. She would just do her best with what she had, and hopefully that would be enough. Meanwhile, as the siblings were making sense of the world, the Aborigines were heading back to their respective abodes with warm hearts and large smiles on their faces. Clutch went back to his home with a full stomach, entering his home's threshold with a smile on his face. Something good happened today, I see. A voice sounded, and he looked up to see his neighbors, new guards Joe and Lee, standing by the stairs to their unit, observing him with curious smiles. Clutch grinned. Well, the territory sent us rewards and bonuses, so I am quite happy. Oh, tell us, the two said, arriving next to him like the gossipy men that they were. The three chatted for several minutes before he was finally released to get back to his precious unit. His unit was located among the first communities to be built. It was something that the Lord called employee benefit, and each of them was allowed to use a full floor to themselves. The Lord said if they contributed well for a year, their respective units would be theirs, even if they didn't become permanent residents. This was a very, very attractive offer to anyone, especially for him. He had never lived amply. His whole life, he had hovered over the line of barely getting through to outright poverty. But after years of hard work, things finally got better for him. This was because when he was in his late 40s, he finally triggered the life occupation. Of course, because he was late to exhibit, it meant that his talent was barely passable. Towns were more likely to pass him over in favor of younger talent with greater potential. He didn't even try to apply to towns, he chose to apply to villages directly. However, professional or not, working in a village would never have gotten him rich. He didn't think he'd own such a house in his lifetime. And it was such a good house, too. To be honest, even when he was serving those nobles back when he was a servant boy, he had never seen such a nice house. Sure, the houses of nobles were large and magnificent, but did they have comfortable bathrooms? Could they cook without wood? Anyway, Clutch went to bed very comfortably, using the new pillow he bought from the supermarket. Ah, so nice, he mused, easily lulled to sleep by the comfort, soon to have very good dreams. Oslo was lying on his bed, now adorned with the so-called cotton materials, looking at the ceiling. In his hand was still the gold he received from the Lord. This was technically the first gold he had ever earned. Oslo was born with a golden spoon and was sent far from the family to hone him. After all, he was already in his late 30s, still a young lad, in his opinion, with his lifespan and all, but he had yet to reach level 30. Moreover, his professional level was stuck at D for a decade. By the standards of his family, this was extremely inferior. Who told him to be so fun-loving? There were so many interesting things and people in the world, how could he have the time to study? So, he was sent to the Chancery of Appointments to find him a harsh job for training. They also set his option to villages only. The problem was, most villages couldn't afford the rate of D-level elemental employees. So it took him a while to get hired. He dated 3 girlfriends while he was waiting. Eventually, to his chagrin, he did get hired. He didn't have any good expectations about a little village, and thought he'd just charm his way from doing anything that was a hassle. Who'd have known he'd be so surprised? He thought he would never help beyond his job description, but their marvel ideas and lovable personalities reached his heart. He felt that the amount of overtime he had done the past week was more than the total time he spent working before coming here. It was tiring, but he'd do it all over again if he had to. More importantly, he had learned more in a few weeks than he could after years in other places. It was amazing. He learned that certain materials could be combined. He learned that certain rooms could have multiple functions. He learned that simple could also mean beautiful, and so much more. And the Lord here, Oslo paused as her smiling face flashed inside his head, was incredibly lovely. He really liked it here. Rowan was practicing his sword in the backyard. Under the light of the 2 moons, he diligently honed the slashes, parries, and techniques he learned as a professional. He then recalled the new moves he learned during his stay, combining them with what he learned, and even combining them with the innovations on his elements. If there were others watching him, they would have enjoyed the view. As a level D swordsman in his late 20s, he was still considered a talent in his town and was quite popular back then. It was also because of this that someone had purged all his means to bind him in an application exclusive to villages. But he had been training with Drake and the others the past few weeks, although his level naturally remained stagnant as he couldn't gain experiences from such weak monsters. He had felt a great improvement in his knowledge nevertheless. Even his elements showed improvements due to their suggestions. This was amazing because no one in the village had awakened their own elements yet. He didn't know certain types of oil could increase his power so much. He didn't know that certain types of fuels could prolong it. There were even some techniques and combinations of chemicals that turned his red fire into a stronger blue one. How did they know so much when they obviously didn't know about the elements? In any case, he knew it wouldn't take long for him to upgrade to see those people must not have expected it. He smirked, looking forward to the day he would see the look on their faces when they saw his growth. 12 days of protection period. Weapons shop. What do you think of this, Master? Troy asked, shyly showing her a detailed drawing of a small weapon. It was similar to a crossbow, but hidden inside one's sleeves. It was perfect for assassination. Her eyes brightened at the design. Amazing, Troy. It's nothing, I just take some knowledge from my hometown. Well, it's nothing if you can't translate it, so don't underestimate your goodness, she told him, but too shy to look him in the eye. I heard you bought a house. Troy received a lot of contribution points for his crossbows and polybolos. Although someone out there owned the patent rights and he had to give up some of his shares, he still earned the majority of the earnings of his own production. He was now one of the few people with the much sought-after permanent residency. Well, yes, I'm paying for the down payment, Troy mumbled, scratching his chin in embarrassment and a little smugness. In his culture, owning a house equated to stability, making him very marriage-worthy. He couldn't help but send the girl in front of him a furtive glance before joining her in work-related chatters. They talked for a while before finally working on the draft. Brenda was a weapons maker, and she had the skill that could immediately understand the inner workings and mechanics of simple weapons. Although he didn't know why indigenous people here didn't already make these weapons with these skills, he was happy to contribute. Anyway, this allowed Brenda to give constructive inputs in the design, making the blind hit processes Troy was committing a lot more efficient. Troy gaped and was not stingy with his compliments, turning Brenda red. Her heart couldn't stop beating at the sight of his sincerely admiring face. There was always something special about this bubbly man. He was always so happy and smiling. His eyes also never lingered on the small scar on the side of her face. This had never happened before. In Xeno, to become a desirable but respected woman, you must either be very beautiful with a high noble status, or a beautiful woman with great strength or skill. Because she was a woman with a man's occupation, coupled with her scar, she was deemed an undesirable woman by everyone. Her previous lover ended their relationship right after she had this scar. More importantly, Troy truly admired her for her skills, and this meant more than anything else. Looking at how things were going for her, Brenda couldn't help but think fate was really mysterious. Back then, when she got to the Chancery of Appointments, she did not even bother filling up requirements higher than a village. Who knew the village that picked her would be so good? Clinic. The beautiful Betty sauntered from patient to patient, checking on their status. The morning light hit her beautiful face and golden hair, mesmerizing a lot of men. She changed the cover of the wounded that her busy assistants hadn't done yet, admiring the material as she did so. It was now using a special plant-based gauze the Lord created and applied herself. This was in contrast to the type they had been using more often, which were gauzes made by the factory. The formulation was also by the Lord, but they were naturally less effective than the ones made by the Lord herself. However, the Lord did give them a couple of rolls of gauze she made herself for emergencies, but otherwise, they used the ones made by the factory. Do not underestimate the quality of the latter though, it was still much better than what she encountered in the city. This gauze could not only protect wounds, but also had the effect of hastening wound healing. It was amazing, and she, as a healer for many years, had never seen it before. It was just that she had heard that this particular patient was a close friend of the Lord, or rather, her brother's, and hence had the honor of experiencing the special product. It was also quite expensive, so she was not stingy with her charging. Fortunately, the people could choose to pay on credit, which was in turn monitored by the system. This time, she was taking off the gauze on the wound of the handsome young patient. When she took it off, the wound had been completely healed. "Sister, you're amazing," the patient's twin said, eyes filled with admiration. "My brother was healed so quickly." Betty smiled. Well, much of it was due to this special gauze. "The expensive gauze you mentioned before," Luke mumbled. He heard a small bolt cost 12 silver. Fortunately, Ansel passed by and gave him a bolt, otherwise they'd be in debt like many others. "Well, it is said that cheaper gauze with lesser effect will be made commercially available soon." Betty paused and smiled. "Of course, I hope you never have to use it." Luke was mesmerized by her smile, staring at her with eyes filled with admiration. She was just his type, pretty and gentle, fit for his strong self. "You're so pretty, are you single?" Betty blinked, taken aback by the question, but she let out a chime-like laugh in response. "How old are you?" "I'm 19. Betty smiled and, looking at the other men eavesdropping in curiosity, chose to tell them some facts. Because she had a decent level, she was also in her level 20 in her late 30s, she looked much younger. 19 was half her age. "Well, I'm 38. Silence ensued in the clinic. "I couldn't tell," Luke exclaimed. His simple mind allowed him to react quickly. She was the same age as his mother. Suddenly, he remembered his still missing mother and felt sad. "Oh my, what's wrong?" Betty asked worriedly. Did she somehow break him? "You are the same age as my mother," he said, shoulders slumped, looking like a sad puppy. "We couldn't find her yet." "You just look so young." Betty's heart softened. "I'm sure she's fine. Having 2 strong sons like you two, she is probably a strong woman herself." Luke nodded while Leo watched on with interest, though also feeling worried for their mum. Soon, optimistic, simple-minded Luke recovered and stared at Betty with admiration. "You really look young though, sister." "Well, I entered level 20 in my 20s, so I aged slower at that point." "You're level 20, he gasped, as did everyone else who was listening in. He was level 4, and he had been so proud of it too. "And also, you age slower." Betty knew the Lord and her people seemed to lack some common sense here. The average lifespan of professionals level 10 and below is unlikely to exceed 100. But when one reaches 20, people could receive 50 to 100 more years. The twins looked at each other and then looked at their pitiful level 4. They thought they were already above average because they were nearing the peak of the level soon. Who knew even the most unassuming woman they met here was at level 20? She wasn't even a combat type, right? They really must get stronger, so embarrassing. After a long time of small talk, the twins finally got checked out and said goodbye to her, as well as the people they knew still in the clinic. Betty watched the twins leave with a bit of melancholy. When she was in the city, she was also quite popular. She also reached a rare level 20 for a woman and was also a rare healer. She had suitors lining up. While she thought it was fine at first, In retrospect, it was really suffocating. Every move was watched, every move was gossiped about, and nearly all her movements were limited. Not to mention, even if she was skilled, she was still a woman in the end. The men had taken for granted that she would at least accept some of their advances. It was incredibly discouraging. Why did she work so hard if she still had to pander after others, even to weaker men? It was probably why when one of her rivals, partnering with a man she rejected, pulled some strings to enter her into a bad job placement contract, she didn't fight too hard. It had been a few years since she started in these smaller places, and the previous ones were not much better than cities in terms of politics. However, she was safe, sound, and highly respected because of her level and skills, so no one dared to slight her. However, she never stayed in a place for more than 3 months. There were many reasons for this. Some of the small towns and villages she'd been to had been breached or lost in wars, while some she volunteered to leave because of politics, others were simply not worth her stay. But now, she walked back to her patients with a smile. No regrets. Lenny stared at the new factory and machines in front of her, with amazement in her usually dull eyes. About a dozen machines her height formed a line, and all around her she could hear the rhythmic hum of diligent workers working to and fro to produce the fabric she loved. Teams of artisans and laborers seamlessly moved about, creating lovely end products soon to be turned into works of art. No, Lenny thought, this process itself was an art. The air thick with a sweeter scent, it was cotton, they said, greeted her nostrils. There were rivers of white clouds on one side. Bunch by bunch, they were processed by specialized artisans, soon transforming into comfortable cloth that people could wear. It was fascinating. From what she gathered, the people here somehow redirected part of the river to make use of so-called water wheels that helped with many of the contraptions. Speaking of contraptions, in the heart of the factory stood massive looms, domineering but also reassuring. She gently watched as their shuttles darted through warp and weft, weaving the threads together with precision. There was also a group of people in charge of dyeing or coloring, their heads often looking over cauldrons of color to check on their quality and consistency. She had seen the end products in the supermarket, and it never failed to amaze her, even if it wasn't the first time she watched them. It was not the first time she had been here. She had been here every day since she was hired, but the carding and spinning of the fibers, the meticulous weaving and dyeing of the cloth, and the entire process never failed to amaze her. Lost in the beauty of the process, her mind churned with ideas, envisioning garments that even nobles would love. She slowly walked around the factory, eyes perusing the machines, trying to absorb their greatness with interest. She still remembered the day when the newly hired workers arrived. There were about a dozen women and a few men. That sight alone was rare for Lenny. Even in her field, it was usually dominated by men like everything else was, but here there was no difference. People just did what they did well. They greeted her enthusiastically, because it was known she was an NPC, whatever it meant, who was working for the territory in a unique setup. Through the system, the territory announced that the public statement was that she would be her own entity and create a business in her own name, and in a partnership with Ms. Althea. The difference was that the private individual would only have to pay a certain amount of tax in exchange. This made the people especially curious about her. Anyway, greeting them with newfound friendliness, Lenny continued on her way around the factory. The building was divided into 4 production lines. The first 2 processed the raw materials, cotton and hemp, they called them. The third one was the weaving into cloth, which fascinated her very much. While she waited for enough batches of cloth, she went to the 4th production line, actual sewing, which was her absolute love. The leader of this team was a woman named Jonah, a kind woman who generously taught her team and her how to use the tools and several types of techniques, many of which were unfamiliar to her. This came as a big surprise. How many people had to work sweat and blood before learning specialized knowledge from someone? However, she saw that no one was as shocked as she had been, so she didn't speak out. Lenny simply took this gratitude to heart and swore to help the other woman out in some other way. As they learned, they chatted, and she learned about the wonderful place these people had called home. Slowly, the life that had its vitality stolen when her son died gradually healed. When her son died, she needed a place to escape, far away from the city she lived in. Villages were the farthest from cities, so she set her ideal destination as such. For years, she went from village to village, eventually numbing the pain. She thought it would be like this until she finally stopped breathing. And on her son's 10th year of death, she was hired by a unique place. She did not even notice the time as they worked. They had already completed hundreds of bolts. Then she heard a bell and saw people stopped working. "Where are you going?" "Work hours are over, Tilda." "What?" People knew she was not from Terran and had an idea of the work culture in this place through the NPCs. Apparently, the Aborigines often had to work until late at night, but the sun had barely even left the sky now, so they could understand the confusion. "We have a standard 10-hour work hours here, including break time. Any more will be as needed, and we will get additional pay." Lenny's dazed self was pulled out of the production line and out to the paved road outside. There she saw the woodworking factory people, and they greeted them amicably. "We are going to the marketplace." "There's an event, Tilda." Come with us, Tilda." "There's an event in the marketplace. Fable would be performing later tonight." "Let's eat our hearts out," Bianca said with a sunny smile, pulling her hand. She was a little startled, but she didn't pull it back. Soon they encountered another group on the road. Lenny's usually dull eyes met with Brenda and Betty's. No words needed to be said, and the women smiled at each other, knowing what the others were thinking. They found it. A place they could be themselves. That night, while most people had gone to the nightlife event, something suggested by Ansel, Althea was at home bonding with her children. She had never been fond of the nightlife, especially not now that she had children. On the other hand, Sheila, Harold, and even Eugene were pulled in by their work teams. Althea had asked them to take some profit from the shops and treat the staff, as a belated celebration for the opening of many of her shops. The children were already in their bedrooms at this time, and though Maya had tried very hard to come with the adults, a little bedtime story got her snoring within a few minutes. Her Barbies, though, were still full of energy because they had a good nap earlier in the day. But it was fine, she wanted to spend more time with them anyway. She watched smilingly as her son rolled around the cot, while her daughter tried endlessly to reach for the ceiling. "Silly Barbies," she said with a chuckle. "I wonder where they got it from." A new voice sounded behind her, and she turned her head to see a warmly smiling Ansel, who rested his weight against the door jamb. It had probably been a while since he started watching them. "You're already here?" Althea asked, surprised. He was the one who was organizing the event after all. "It's all set up," Ansel said with a shrug, sitting down next to her on the carpeted floor. "I found I've grown out of that phase," he said, shrugging. Though he really had his fun and women, nothing beats a relaxing night at home with family. He had already lost too many loved ones, and he had long left that phase of his life. He turned to look at the utterly adorable Barbies on the cot, and he couldn't help but poke the nearby meatball's chubby cheeks. "MNGWR," little meatball babbled, drooling, his cute eyebrows furrowed a bit. "Yes, I think you're handsome too." Althea laughed. "Well, it's good that you thought of a party though. Everyone needed a good place to just let it go, safely and in a fun way." "Well, citizen happiness is also important in those infrastructure games I used to play," he said, winking, and Althea giggled again. Ansel smiled as he turned his attention back to the Barbies, and they played Who Rolled Better and other tiring, dizzying games until they fell asleep. Very proud of lulling the children to sleep, he turned to look at Althea, who was looking outside the window, deep in thought. The light of the two moons, one reddish, one bluish, combined to give her face a different sort of illumination. Althea was as beautiful as always. With deep eyes, Ansel settled the Barbies before standing up and sitting closely beside her. "What's the matter?" Althea didn't speak for a while before sighing. "I just got a report from Rowan that the monsters outside are no more than level 3, which were relatively uncommon to encounter in the first place. Even Drake has stagnated to level 5. Next to her, Drake was the strongest Terran. The fact that he stagnated meant that everyone else probably would as well. I'm worried that the monsters outside would be shockingly strong. What level would the monsters outside be? What level of mobs do we have to face after the protection period?" Ansel couldn't help but recall the horrors of their first arrival. The lifting of the protection likely meant they would experience that again, maybe even worse. It made his heart drop to his stomach. The NPCs, they're all at least level 15, and they had no haughtiness in them at all. Like, it was a normal level at their age. Ansel frowned. This was, indeed, worrisome. I am wondering how to further increase our level before the protection period ends. Although the guards have been hunting around, she received reports that most of the mobs were level 1s and 2s. Such weak mobs are not conducive to their level up. A lot of people have stagnated. She herself didn't even bother going out anymore. She would just tire herself for a little experience. Ansel looked at her in amusement. She was worrying about this issue so much. While correct and valid, he knew other territories were still worrying about how to deal with the current mobs. If other territories heard her concerns, they would definitely band together and hate on her. He sighed and stretched his hands in the air, placing them behind his back. Even if the highest level is level 3, I wonder if there's a way to call a mob of them. At least they could upgrade by quantity. It was better than nothing. However, just as he said this, the light of idea simultaneously passed through their heads. They paused and looked at each other. It seemed that there really was a way to get these beasts to attack her. A beast tied. The one that came with an upgrade. Althea paused. It seemed she still had to aim to level up after all. She opened her Lord tab and looked closely at the territory stats. Territory stats. Status level 2 village. Area 3,142,000 square meters. Residents 1,002, 188 permanent, 814 temporary. Total population 1997. Base resources. Wood 9,501,000. Stone 8,208,000. Money 15,591 gold, 112,963 silver, 469,497 copper. Reputation 110. Buildings, Village Center LV2, Weaponry Shop LV1, Defensive Wall LV3, Warehouse LV2, Farm LV1, Training Hall LV1, Bathhouse LV1. Bonus Building, Custom Building. Building Slots 7 plus 1. There was no indicator of what population needed to upgrade. However, based on some stories from the NPCs as well as the requirements of the previous upgrade, she could surmise that it was probably 1,000 residents and around 3,000 fixed population for 3 consecutive days. If so, then although the number of residents had met the standard, the population itself still lacked 1,000. The problem is that our location is quite far from others. We were also established quite late. Most people had already settled in the nearest territories by the time we were built. Althea then looked at Ansel and finally spoke about an issue she had been ruminating about for a while. I have something I want to try, but I'll need your assistance on this. Ansel straightened up. Will he finally be able to help? She nodded. Ansel was among the first group of newcomers who were not really refugees, but rather immigrants from other territories. This inspired her on what she could do next. Anyway, from what she heard, a lot of these territories weren't very good. Tell me, Ansel said, a little antsy, and she smiled slyly at him. Since people have already settled down, she paused, then we'll just have to attract them here, won't we? The siblings discussed for a long time, scheming, planning, on increasing the population by 1,000 within the next few days. To facilitate the planning, Althea taught Ansel the tagging technology of this continent, which amazed the latter very much. So convenient, he said, awed, eyes staying on the various points on his map. Although Bull taught him how to exchange maps before, he didn't know he could save coordinates and send it to others. In contrast with just the maps, the tagging system could assist directionally as well. This was actually more helpful to him, someone who didn't have a stellar sense of direction, than just melding maps he may or may not understand. In a game, it was like that arrow that showed up on front of the character, and you just had to follow where it was pointing at. It's amazing, some of the things that appeared here. Indeed, Althea said with some emotion. While some returned to the ancients, some became more convenient in a way that we couldn't have had imagined, very magical. Anyway, the two of them studied the expanded maps with the other territories Ansel had been to, namely, Vismont in the west and Bright in the southwest. She saw that the straight-line distances between both Bright and Vismont actually weren't far. Vismont was less than 50 km, while Bright was a little over this. Considering the terrain, the one-way trip to each one should take no more than a day. Ansel looked at the map with a complicated expression. Judging by the map, he pretty much missed Althea many times during his travels. Like, he took 1 or 2 wrong turns and he ended up in the wrong territory. To think I took weeks to get here, he said, regretful he hadn't arrived sooner. Maybe he could have been there when she was giving birth. Althea smiled at him comfortingly. Well, if you had, we may have a lot of trouble meeting the requirements, right? Nothing that happened needed be wasted, Althea said, sounding like an old woman. Everything had its uses, and everything could be taken advantage of. Ansel stared at her deeply before nodding, patting his chest. Let me lead this mission, Althea. Well, maybe you can lend me Rowan. Althea nodded. It was her plan anyway. Not only did Ansel know a lot about these territories and their lords, he was also a pretty good representative. Of course, she would still get Mathilda to send some of her officers to handle the diplomacy. However, Althea had always been a forward thinker. She didn't want the surge of population to be so dependent on an exodus which, especially after the protection period, would definitely be more dangerous than it was now. Other than attracting citizens, I have another task for you, she said, looking at him seriously. Ansel leaned over, very interested in contributing. Tell me, what do we need to do? He paused. I mean other than attracting citizens. Althea traced over some path in her own territorial map, which of course Ansel could not see. As Ansel mentioned, although the straight-line distance wasn't that far, the terrain definitely made it impossible to just traverse it so directly. So other than attracting people, she wanted to send out another task. It was to create passive guidance towards the territory. That was, pathways. Building stone paths would be too much work, for now, with the construction within the territory at full blast. However, clearing a simple trekking path and adding signs would be good enough. She told him of her plans and he nodded in agreement. In this way, even when we're not on a mission, more people could get here much easier, he said, and he couldn't help but remember his own struggles. If there was a path, he definitely would have taken less than half the time to find this place. Ansel was very excited about this change, as if improving it would make up for the failures of the previous days. When will we start? Soon, she said, opening her Lord panel. Before doing anything, she filled up the existing lands with housing depending on their zoning. She added more and more dormitories and commercial units. Since the supermarket, every commercial unit had been rented out. This was understandable because the supermarket provided raw materials for various industries to finally start working. There were thousands of people in the territory. Each one had their own sets of knowledge to contribute to their Althea. Not to mention, anyone with the slightest business sense knew that the sooner they started, the more money they'd make. The demand for stores would also rise up with the imminent surge of population. Hence, she would be building more of the type in the future. She planned to place a grocery store branch in the Western Avenue, as well as the luxury areas. As for another supermarket, another building would wait for the next upgrade. The rest of the land was filled with farms and provisions for a few more factories. Satisfied with the maximization of the remaining space, Althea judged that they were now ready. She raised her hand, scheduling several announcements for the next day. 11 days of protection period. The next day, other than the fact that the land had suddenly filled up, a new announcement made the territory boil. Territory Mission A, clear the way to neighbors. Completion, make a simple path to an existing territory village, level 2 and above. Minimum requirement, a team with 70% level 3 and above. Rewards, 5,000 contribution points per team of 10 people. Side tasks, bring more people to the territory. Reward, 300 contributions per person for direct recruitment, 100 points for indirect recruitment. Most people were still wiping the goo off their eyes when they saw the announcement. Without exception, their backs all straightened up, rereading the contents at least twice before reacting. After doing so, it could be said that all lethargy had been blown away. Oh my goodness, what a way to wake them up. The territory made another big move. It was no exaggeration to say that the announcement got everyone out of their beds. For instance, in the dormitories, a few minutes after daybreak, all public living areas were filled with teams meeting up. What do you think? Crow asked his teammates, eyes fixed on the new announcement. Shall we join in? He paused, looking at his teammates, to Vismont. At his question, Sunny and Dog nodded passionately. I want to take meat from that guy, Sunny exclaimed, still remembering the humiliation they went through just before leaving. Dog's fist clenched and raised up as if punching an imaginary Vismont lord there. We'll make them blade. The trio looked at each other with sly, excited smiles. Who couldn't tell that the territory was trying to poach people? They would also be saving people with this, so they were technically doing good deeds too. Let's buy breakfast while we plan, Crow said, feeling his stomach grumbling a little. Before the announcement was made, they were planning to go shopping for breakfast in the marketplace, just before going out of the territory to hunt and level up. It could be said that their stomachs adjusted to Althera's standards very quickly. Crow still remembered that a few days ago, he could bear a day of hunger without any problems. Now, he was hungry at least thrice a day. He was getting spoiled, he thought. They probably wouldn't survive in other territories after seeing the goodness of Althea. Hearing the plan for eating, the other two immediately nodded in agreement. And so, the trio headed to the marketplace in a happy mood, quite looking forward to what they could do to those bastards. As they left the building, however, their feet paused as did the others. They looked around, realizing that the scenery had changed more than a little bit. Sunny tilted her head in wonder. There seems to be a few more dormitory buildings. Wudruwa, Dog mumbled as his rounded eyes looked and made a mental count. He couldn't help but laugh as he counted, turning his head to his friends. The territory's really targeting a lot of people this time. Crow looked around in a relaxed mood and nodded. Indeed, and obviously the territory will welcome them well. Sunny giggled and clapped her hands. Now let's make contributions and help the territory achieve it. The trio went to a random stall, there were so many choices, and waited patiently for their order as they chatted. Will it be alright though, is it safe? Sunny couldn't help but ask, slightly reconsidering after a bit more thought. We naturally will be teaming up with the guards for safety reasons. Those Vismont pests don't have a chance against our guards. Dog smiled, and then huffed, crossing his arms. Let's see how that lord would iron this one out. Crow nodded, looking forward to it. Then, a wisp of aroma went straight to their noses and to their hearts, completely halting the ongoing conversation. Here's your order, the young girl said with a smile. 3 orders of Yui fruit bread and 6 orders of Gugu bird dumplings. The delicious smell of food wiped away the aggressiveness in them. Suddenly, Sunny was reluctant to leave. But I want to relax more, they've only been here a few days. Can't they enjoy it more before heading out to battle again? Dog, who was no less aggressive a second prior, nodded in agreement. Crow looked at these 2 unstable idiots and rubbed his throbbing temple. We can do that after we become permanent residents. The contribution points would allow them several steps closer to this goal. They didn't even have their own houses and could only live in dorms at the moment. Sure, the dorms were much more comfortable than their lodgings in Vismont, but how could they be satisfied when they watched others steadily improving their lifestyles? How envious they were every time they saw a person or a family moving out of the dormitories to rent, or maybe even purchase, their own home. The 2 looked at him pitifully and he rolled his eyes. His sights ended up on the food on their hands, tasty, affordable, and completely unavailable anywhere else. A flash of inspiration hit his head, and he let out a rare smirk that somewhat scared the other 2. Eat eyes, you all right, bro? Crow ignored their concerned looks and smiled at them, creeping them out even more. Actually, won't we be able to attract more people if they gain a more intuitive understanding of the territory? He asked them. That is, we let them know about the resources and lifestyle the territory offers. The 2 gaped at him a bit slow, and Crow decided to get to the point. We could buy some things to sell there, and we would definitely be able to sell for a high price there. The 2 were in a daze for a while, and brightened when they finally absorbed the implications. Genius! In this way, not only would they become permanent residents by virtue of their contribution points, but they could directly buy a house with the money they earned by reselling. Dog patted his back in glee. I knew behind that dark exterior of yours is a very enlightened brain. Crow's mouth twitched. And so, for the rest of that morning, they borrowed money from Bull and started to source food with long shelf lives like rice, wheat, jerky, noodles, and the like. Calculating their overall money, they should be able to buy kilograms of each to sell. It was unfortunate they had a purchase limit. Even if their space was full, they could bring some bags with them, right? If there were more than a handful of rickshaws available, maybe they'd rent them out too. Regardless, they really wanted to buy a lot more than this. Then again, it seemed Bull already gave them a bulk of his money. Where else would they get another investor? This wouldn't do, they needed better deals. At this, Crow's brain started churning ideas again, until it really landed on one. Crow paused and whipped his head towards his companions. Isn't Boss Ansel related to the owner of the supermarket? The other two gasped, this time quickly understanding what he meant. Crow was really a genius. In fact, the Vismont trio were not the only group who had thought about this. The other teams heading to the other two territories had similar schemes brewing in their minds. While most people were heading to the west and south, some partnered with others to go to a new territory east. Basically, there were a lot of teams that were very interested in this mission. All of them had one or two people who were sly enough to see the business opportunities in this mission, almost as soon as it was sent out. For instance, Luke and Leo, or more accurately, just Leo, also thought of the same thing as Crow and the others. This was the one variable that could get them a hell of a lot better deals: Ansel. So, very early that day, Althea had to deal with someone's cheesy pandering. Althea Tilda's sister Althea Tilda. This guy had almost always called her by name. When he called her Sister Tilda, then he must have a favor to ask. I have a favor to ask, I promise it's win-win Tilda, he said. Continue. It's about the supermarket, he paused, and Althea couldn't help but look at her own accounting. She looked at the sources of income and saw how the supermarket was doing. The turnover of the supermarket had always been very strong. It wasn't until Ansel came with a sycophant smile on his face that Althea realized the sales were faster than usual. Althea was actually quite interested. She crossed her arms and looked at him. What do you want? Ansel grinned. Yes. An hour later, the supermarket posted an announcement through the village center. Gia Supermarket. In light of the new Level A mission sent by the territory, Gia Supermarket will temporarily waive the purchase limits. This will be applicable only to teams registered for the Inter-Territory Connection mission sent by the territory. There will also be a 20% discount for all temporary and permanent residents. Let's help the village together. Yes. This announcement made everyone absolutely thrilled. Those who had been hesitating due to the potential dangers were outright injected with courage. Why? Because they also thought what those teams thought: business, money. So many people rushed to the stores, and not just the wood factory. If there were rickshaws available for sale or rent, it was estimated all of them would also be swept out by now. Unfortunately, the wood factory refused because the rickshaws, without rubber, would definitely just give way in the current terrain. Anyway, regardless of whether there were rickshaws, the travel time was only 1 day, and much of the food available easily lasted longer than that. For a while, all shops in the territory flourished even more. Fortunately, the latest batch of crops were just harvested, and with overtime work, the shops could meet the large demands of the market. Each factory was thus inundated with orders. It came to the point where Sheila and Harold hadn't even sat down to rest for several hours straight. Althea, however, reminded them that the quality must not be compromised, and they followed this to the best of their abilities. Of course, not everyone was excited about just the money. Among the people joining the mission, there were also plenty who thought more deeply than the profit. Dennis was one of these people. This is also a chance to find loved ones safely, he said. He had a stable job as a farmer now. He could definitely provide for them well after he found them. Speaking of jobs, he really found the best. Ms. Althea was a goddess, like always, and announced anyone who joined the mission would get paid leave. Paid leave? Right. My sister hasn't been found yet, but I was too scared to go find her alone. Yes, now teams will be led with level 3s, or above it is safer. But I'm only level 2. Considering the competition for the slots, we wouldn't be able to come then. We must train harder so we can join the next exodus. I hear half of the guards will also be joining. More and more people came to the village center to register to join in. The line to use the platforms reached past the square, and it was still growing. Of course, many of them knew it was a long shot to be approved. Even if 30% of the slots were for people below level 3, would they really choose non-fighters to come with them? Then, while someone was chatting with a friend as they waited, his peripheral vision caught sight of someone climbing down the second floor. A new NPC, he yelled, and everyone on the ground floor turned their heads to the stairs simultaneously. The man was taken aback. What's an NPC? Who, him? Someone couldn't help it and walked to him. Welcome to Althea, Mr. NPC. Can we know what shop you're building? There were many words the new NPC did not understand, but he answered what he could. I am a woodworker, NPC. I was asked by the territory to find a man named Baron and cooperate with him. This made everyone pause and look at each other. This could be done. Then again, Ms. Althea seemed to have this privilege also. What an honor, envy. The woodworker could only stare at the people in a daze, wondering what they were on about. It was indeed true that the Lord asked him to work for Baron, in exchange for some tax. This way, she would not be the only individual to hire NPCs. She could also do this for future Aborigine hired. After all, she wanted them maximized and placed where they could shine the most. The new NPC seemed a bit overwhelmed by the stares, and quickly left as soon as he found out where this Baron guy was. This episode soon ended, and their attention resumed to the upcoming mass exodus. Everyone couldn't help but imagine the gains of this trip, and they couldn't help but chatter and cheer energetically at what was to come. Oh, how exciting! 10 days of protection period. On the 22nd day after the migration, nearly 80% of the territory's population was wide awake well before daybreak. Althea watched as 100 or so residents flowed out to explore almost as soon as the day began, before heading out of the house herself. She decided to perfect the current circle before the new wave of people came. Then, after the upgrade, she would use the expansion rights for 2 levels and use the best available walls. The current territory was big enough for her, but after the upgrade, it would quadruple its size. The high-level walls would also be very expensive. But she believed in the income of the territory. Even if it wasn't, she would definitely find a way to build the strongest wall that could be purchased at her level. After everything, Althea was still heavily biased in defense. In any case, all these were problems for later. She went back to sleep and woke up when the light of the sun shone through, and prepared herself and her Barbies for their morning walk. A couple of minutes later, Althea headed out and went to the farms with the strollers. In her current stage, the farms had the heaviest role in her economy. She had to pay special attention to it. Since she had added hundreds more farmlands last night, the farm area had now been maximized with more than 700 fields, some of which were in the mountains, mostly orchards for cocoa and coffee. Out of the 700 fields, about half of which were still being planted, as most were just reclaimed yesterday. As for the older fields, a lot of the rest with short-cycle plants were already harvested. One of the more important harvests was cotton, which was the crop's first main harvest. This also meant their supply could increase by leaps and bounds, and the clothing stores lined up would finally open. With the help of her pharmacist-grade fertilizers and the farms, as well as some hired assistants from farming elder grew, the few dozen of the fields dedicated to the plant had flourished. For her personal garden fields back home, she focused on more sensitive plants, local or terran, as well as breeding new terran plants and creating seeds. When the quantity of seeds was enough and sustainable, she would also open a seed store for both local and terran plants. However, because of their special status, only permanent residents would be allowed to purchase seeds, and still in a limited quantity. Other territories could also go into a partnership with her, but she'd definitely give a high price. Back to her garden, she went to one section she dedicated to terran flowers like roses, orchids, and the like. It was a sea of color and an immersion in fragrance. It was an incredibly beautiful sight. The kids babbled happily at the lovely surroundings that occupied their senses. Anyway, she had long confirmed that they didn't have allergens, so she didn't worry too much about the Barbie's exposure. After a relaxed walk, she soon ended up in the greenhouse under construction. With the help of Eugene and Oslo, a small greenhouse was about to be built and tested. For now, it was made of Uli stone and insulating materials, and theoretically workable and duplicable. Time would tell how effective it was, but it was still a step in the right direction. Overall, the agricultural aspect of the territory was on track, and that alone let her heave a huge sigh of relief. Like defense, food sustainability was her main focus for the territory. What a relief, she said, looking over at her Barbies. You don't have to suffer growing up. MMH Hamgama Tilda. Dooglag. She giggled and played with the Barbies for a while, until the familiar ding sounded in her mind. It has been detected that a total of 100,000 kilograms of plants have been harvested in the farmlands. The farmlands are now eligible for upgrade. Plants in LV2 farms will be granted 30% increase in productivity and 100% increase in survivability. Would you like to upgrade all existing farmlands for 723 gold? She flinched in shock as she stared at the notification. An upgraded farm. Survivability. Yes. Yes, of course. She had always worried about what would happen to her plants when one of those annual extreme weather changes happened. They all worked so hard in these fields. Not only would she feel sad, but it was estimated the entire territory would be depressed. This upgrade was just what she needed. Of course, the greenhouse would still be retained. Survivability was increased by 100%, but this was very misleading. After all, what was the actual value of survivability that was doubled in the first place? 10%, 5%, maybe even less. Maybe the change was even negligible. However, Althea thought that any improvement in this field was a welcome one. She was sure the others would too. She didn't lack that amount of gold, anyway. However, as someone who didn't take losses, she also made an announcement to the territory. Farmlands have now been upgraded to level 2. The rental fees after one plant cycle will be increased by 3 times. Level 2 farmlands have increased production of 30%, 100% increase in survivability, 50% resistance to extreme weather changes. Those who hope to rent level 1 farmlands shall request for new fields in the village centre. She nodded. This was fair. Anyway, there were remaining 10 or so hectares in the agricultural area, dedicated to raising free-range breeding of gugu birds and, in the future, other livestock. They didn't need too much space for now. She could give some space to people who hoped to retain the level 1 farmland and build them there. Of course, this was only in the unlikely case that someone would rather have the cheaper default option. It was also worth noting that the very expensive upgrade was probably not really based on the additional 10% productivity, but on survivability. Hopefully, the citizens understood this well enough. After all, some time ago, she had made sure everyone was aware of the imminent weather changes, at least to a certain degree. She had announced the news she got from the NPCs through the information tab. She even pinned it so it wouldn't get buried in the plethora of information coming in every day. By this time, most people should be aware of the unusual weather patterns of this world. No matter what, she wanted everyone to be prepared for whatever they might encounter. To the best of their capabilities, anyway. Anyway, whatever would happen, her beautiful fields were here at present, and she ought to appreciate them. She looked down at the 2 Barbies, who she realized had been staring at her in curiosity all this while. She giggled, leaning down to give them a few kisses. She lifted them out of the stroller and walked around the flower fields with them, telling them their names and uses. The Barbies didn't understand anything, of course, but they loved hearing their mother's gentle voice, and they were giggling the whole time. Some minutes later, she walked back to the stroller and settled the twins back there. She took out her phone, newly charged by solar batteries, from the space and took photos of the beautiful scenery. With a smile, her video turned to the cuties inside the stroller. The 2 children smiled and laughed as if they knew what she was doing. They were both very photogenic. She then raised her arm to take a selfie of the 3 of them. With the screen also facing the Barbies, she showed them the picture they took together. Althea smiled at how cute they were, her finger robotically hovering on the send button, unconsciously about to send the photo to her husband. Later, sighed. Pushing back the pang of longing, she just leaned down the stroller and smacked her Barbie's cheeks with kisses. Her husband wasn't here, but she could love the children for him as well. Her mood turned a bit dour regardless. With a sigh, she decided to open the panel to distract herself and then turned to look at the overall status of the territory. Territory stats. Status Level 2 Village. Area 3,142,000 square meters. Residents 1015, 188 permanent, 827 temporary. Total population 2124. Base resources: wood 9661,0000. Stone 8310,8000. Money 15,611 gold, 113,263 silver, 478,197 copper. Reputation 110. Buildings: village center LV2, weaponry shop LV1, defensive wall LV3, warehouse LV2, farm LV2, training hall LV1, bathhouse LV1. Bonus building: custom building. Building slots 7 plus 1. They hung out there for a while until she decided to walk back home. She started pushing the stroller forward, and the children, who were cooing adorably in place, laughed at the sudden jolt. Her heart softened and filled with fluff at the sight of them, but in the back of her mind, she thought of how her husband was and how he might be suffering so far from them. She reached the main avenue in a melancholic mood. As she walked, she saw a couple of acquaintances hanging around in one of the breakfast shops on the East Avenue. It was Gru, and he was happily bonding with Harold and Clutch. From what she could see from where she was, they were laughing boisterously in an old man sort of way, and she couldn't help but smile a bit. The friendship of old men was a joy to watch, and she liked listening to them sharing stories. So today, she decided to join them. Boss, MS Althea. Myla, Ms. Althea. She smiled, good morning, and the men greeted her, clearing up a space for her to sit comfortably. Like Harold, who already ate breakfast at home, she only ordered some finger foods. Working hours didn't start until an hour later, and these guys loved spending time as soon as the day started. Gru seemed to have read the notice and was very, very happy. Have you read the news? It's amazing. Althea nodded and smiled. Our road to self-sufficiency will only get richer. The old man nodded repeatedly and hummed. Althea paused as she saw Clutch. She decided to ask some doubts about it. You mentioned there will be extreme weather changes once a year or two, right? He nodded, and Gru looked focused. The territory had said something about this, but not enough information was provided to do much about it. How are the plants affected by it, the ones already planted as well as the plants to be planted? I only know that existing plants old enough in good farmland have a chance of survival. Otherwise, the plants would just go to waste. Further, new plants would not grow. Gru gaped at them, and his eyebrows furrowed in worry. The upgraded farmland will definitely increase survivability, but I doubt it would be high. We need to figure out other ways. Althea nodded. The extreme weather lasted for half a month to a month. She just needed to ensure the stock lasted. Even better was to create a condition where plants could grow, even in the harshest of weathers. Giant greenhouses, the sort that spanned acres. Making a small greenhouse in her backyard was no problem, but creating large structures was a different problem altogether. Did she have the technology for it? No, unfortunately not. Anyway, there was no use worrying about it too much for now, albeit research for it would definitely continue and be expedited. She still had so many things to improve that were within her control, but no less important. For example, salt, a necessity for long-term health and survival. Fortunately, the rock salt mission was very popular. Although it was a bit far, the pay was very good, and they were promised a certain amount of processed salt. As for the processing, although not many people knew how to process salt, there would still be a handful of people who did. She hired them all. What she worried about was the eventual thinning of the rock salt. By her estimate, it could still last a few years, but this world was too unpredictable. Who knew, maybe there'd be an earthquake, and all the rock salt would disappear. She shivered, scary. She made a mental note to prioritize looking for other sources of salt as well, though from what she heard their approximate location might be too far off the sea. Another mission that had been going on was the uprooting of young wall trees. The past few days she had already filled half a field with them. Soon they would have a ready source of resin and the like, which would push their technology another step forward. Finally, the Gugu bird missions were also very productive. There were also people who rented fields and used some of them to raise the chickens. In this way, there would also be plenty of other channels of production. There would be richer products, richer pockets, and a richer treasury. In any case, whatever happened with all these uncertainties, she was happy to see the territory was on track. No matter what, she would prepare what was to come the best she could, and she knew her citizens would do the same. They were all Ulterans, after all. Meanwhile, outside the territory, the people on the pathfinding mission were already past the first leg. For the first leg of the trip, the people heading southwest and west traveled together. There were plenty of reasons for this. First, it would reduce the cost of the formation of the pathways, as there would be shared paths. This would also increase the chances of convergence between parties, increasing safety against enemies. Third, according to the consolidated maps they had gathered, they found that even if there were flatter lands southwards, the land after it was rough terrain. It was simply not practical to segregate early on. For those going to Bright Village, this was choosing a relatively harder terrain at first, then going a smoother trip. Overall, it was a more practical, safer and faster path for them to join the Vismont team at first. And finally, and most importantly, the more the merrier. Finally, almost halfway there, Ansel said, stretching his arms as they walked forward. He looked at his team in front that was clearing up the path. The teams going south to Bright Village were Ansel, Derek, a handful of guards and several scores of citizens. On the other hand, the team going west to Vismont were Rowan, the twins, the Crow Trio, a score of guards, and about a few scores of citizens. The contrast was because Vismont was tagged as a potentially aggressive territory, while Bright, although with a lord of questionable origin, had more sincere consideration for the citizens. "Are you excited to see other villages?" Sunny asked her new friend, Cassie, who, like her, was a rare level 3 among the girls. The other girl nodded. "I hope to find my little brother. He was playing with his friends when it happened." She had heard that most people who survived the first transformation would have a relative or two who also survived. She and her grandmother had been anchoring on this as they made a life for themselves in Altera. Her grandmother, a former seamstress, had gotten a job with the new seamstress NPC, who was planning on renting her own store in the territory. The pay was very good and safe, and Cassie really had no worries with leaving for a few days. This was especially true since after entering level 2, her grandmother's knees had really gotten better. Now, she just hoped to find her teenage brother and their family would be complete. Sunny, on the other hand, was very envious. Unlike most people here with relatives within the country, hers weren't. She was actually a foreigner in Eden. She lived most of her life in the western country of Orbros. She simply got into an international exchange program that was scheduled to end the month the disaster happened. Fortunately, a lot of her good friends survived, and they were getting through it together. Similar conversations echoed within the group, and they chatted about their lives and dreams. Of course, they tried to do so without losing focus on the surroundings. Along the way, the group followed the territory instruction of clearing a trekking path and placing signages in visible areas. The trekking paths were created by moving loose stones to keep the plants from growing too quickly. If often used, it could stop the growth of plants in those pathways. As for the signages, each team was provided with 100, secured by the guard team. These signages were provided by Baron's company and bought by the system for contribution points. One had to note that these weren't normal signages. This was created by the new level E woodworker NPC that was hired by Baron for a whooping 20 gold a month. Speaking of Baron, he was very shocked when he found an NPC outside his door, and even more shocked at the asking price. Baron always felt that the territory itself had commission for this hire, but he had no proof. But still, he hired the guy. One was for goodwill, but more importantly, his sharp business eyes really could see potential in this aborigine. No matter what, he still believed the territory wouldn't force its citizens in a disadvantageous position. And he was very glad he followed this instinct, because the product this guy made was really magical. For instance, the signage bought in bulk by the travelers was not the normal wooden sign. These signages were not only good to look at, it even had a passive effect of attracting attention, literally. It could attract the attention of any intelligent creature within 5 meters of its location. What could this mean? This meant magic ads, damn it. Further, and perhaps more importantly, the direction could be set permanently. That was to say that if the signage was accidentally misplaced, it would always point to the direction set when it was first installed. This naturally created huge demands, not only for those on this mission, but for the many shop owners in the territory. The woodworker's schedule was filled for the next couple of days, with the orders amounting to hundreds. It could be said this business boomed. But if anyone was surprised at how well the products were doing, it was the creating NPC himself. Hauser, a mere level E woodworker, didn't have a good life even after awakening the occupation. This was because he received only skills related to these traditionally labeled useless things. He thought that he'd spend his life making unpopular works, so he could only last a decent territory for a month or two before being let go. Who knew he'd be commissioned to create hundreds of his works almost as soon as he got hired? The poor old man almost cried. However, this fact cemented yet another loyal borderline-obsessed aborigine to Althea. The journey of the two combined groups was smoother than anticipated. They had encountered several mobs along the way, but they were just level 1s and very few level 2s. The minimum requirement for joining the mission was level 3, so it was basically a breeze. This came as a relief to all of them, but of course, the guards didn't stop reminding them to keep their vigilance. How embarrassing would it be to get injured on advantageous planes? In any case, the two parties were set to separate a few kilometers from Althea, in a small valley at the end of the mountain range. It was a predetermined intersection, decided when Derek, Rowan and Ansel were studying the topography. This place might not be exactly equidistant from the two territories, but it was a location highly visible, even if people came from different directions. The terrain also allowed it to be better protected against the open air and winds. At the same time, its altitude was not so low that it would easily fall victim to flash floods. Soon they arrived at the place and set up camp. A relatively large stone platform was formed at this time, about 10 square meters. They also added grout-like substances, stone chairs, and others. They were careful not to damage the soft surfaces until they were cured. They also set up rough, easy-to-build sheds around this circle, as sturdy as it could be considering the limited time and materials it was made of. In the middle of the stone circle was a small soiled area with stones stacked up, and some wood and leaves as fuel in the center. Above it was a huge metal pot, which was something Oslo manifested with all his power that day because of its permanence. This would allow passers-by to cook a meal well, to add energy to their journey that would still take a couple of hours. Of course, they made sure to tie it to the ground, to keep unscrupulous people from taking it away. Rowan watched as the team did as the territory asked with enthusiasm. He was curious, as this was not rewarded at all, so he asked the one nearest to him why they were being so detailed. The man looked at him in surprise, but then his expression became melancholic. "I just think it would be good if my children could find this path. I thought it would be good for them to find such a good place to rest." Rowan's eyes faltered, and he nodded, finally understanding what the Lord meant before they left. Before leaving, the Lord instructed them to make sure the paths would be built well, build them with comfort and hope in mind. He knew that the Lord planned to make this into a rest area. The Lord said that if they could get more people with builder occupation, she would build sturdier rest houses in these intersections. The Lord was really so kind, so considerate. And the people. Rowan looked around at the people enthusiastically, doing more than ordered for people they didn't even know they'd see again. Some people even placed some non-perishable foods on makeshift stone trunks and boxes. Some even left covered earthenware for destined people to find. These were all without rewards, and at no prompt of the guards at all. Rowan couldn't help but be touched by the camaraderie and sense of a bigger self these people had. He hoped that the people would find the path the Lord and her citizens built for them. He didn't know them, and yet he inexplicably found himself praying for them.